Hi, I'm Rebecca DeHarling, a paper lantern writer, and with me today is fellow paper lantern writer Linda Ulleseit. Hi, Linda.
Hi, glad to be
Thanks for
here.
joining me today. So we're going to talk about Colson Whitehead's latest novel, Harlem Shuffle, and of course, he's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner for his novels. The Nickel Boys and The Underground Railroad, but he's also written other things. And um, I saw a short interview with him in which he said he likes to sort of jump around. He's written like a zombie novel, which I was not aware of, a coming of age story, a poker memoir. And he said that when he sat down to write uh, Harlem Shuffle, he wanted to do something lighter because he had done the other two very serious ones, Underground Railroad and the Nickel Boys, and needed something lighter. And he wanted to do a heist novel. Pardon me. He wanted to do a heist novel. And so we have Harlem Shuffle. I'm going to give a very brief synopsis of what happens. And by the way, this discussion is going to be full of spoiler alerts. So if that really bothers you, then you don't have to watch us live. You can always go to the recording, which will be on our YouTube channel, our Paper Lantern Writers YouTube channel. So here we go. The novel is divided into three parts. And the first part is set in 1959. All three parts are, of course, in Harlem. And the first one centers on a uh, a robbery that of the Hotel Teresa, which is the sort of the place to go for all of the like high prestige, rich, elite Black members of the community and of the country. A lot, if they're there, they stay at the Hotel Teresa. So, but they decide they're going to rob it because there's going to be a lot of stuff that people have put in the safety boxes at the hotel. So we see how that goes, and it's sort of what happens is it draws the main character, Ray Carney, further into sort of the illegitimate side of his doings. And we'll talk a lot more about that as we go along. In the second part, it's all about vengeance. Ray Carney is trying to get into a club, an elite club, and it's his understanding that if he gives this one person who happens to be a banker an envelope, there are lots of envelopes that go around in this novel. If he gives him an envelope and it's $500, that it's his understanding this will get him into the club, and he doesn't get into the club. He goes to see the banker, and the banker's like, I'm not giving you that money back. That was no guarantee. So the second part is focuses on Carney planning his revenge, and it's very complex and very complete. And in the third part, the second part takes place in 1961. The third part is in 1964. Carney has become, he's a furniture salesman. He owns a furniture store, and he's become quite prosperous. The background of this story is uh, riots in 1964, which happened in Harlem after a young Black boy was killed by a policeman. Unfortunately, still very prominent today. And in this story, that's the background. The story centers on his cousin Freddie, whom Ray Carney has known since they're like brothers, and Freddie's always sort of getting him into more and more trouble. So it's kind of what happens to Freddie and a friend of his, a friend that he makes who's the son of a very rich family, they keep saying the Van Wyck or the Van Wyck. Different people decide how they're going to pronounce it. But I think ultimately it should be the Van Wykes, and what happens to Freddie and ultimately the consequences for Ray too, from getting involved with that rich white family. Okay, so we said it was a heist novel. At least that's how Whitehead described it in the interview. Did you feel like it was a heist novel, Linda?
I think that's just a secondary part to it. I mean, it's just not what the novel is about. It's so richly layered that yes, there's a heist in it, but you could just call it so many other things. You could call it a family saga novel. You could call it a 60s race riot novel. You could call it all kinds of things. It's more about Ray Carney's journey than it is about the actual heist.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting though. A couple of two different reviewers said this is not a zany novel. I guess heist and zany somehow go together. And one reviewer said something that I thought was really interesting, and it was kind of like he lets the fun of a heist. He lets his characters have that fun of a heist because their lives don't necessarily include a lot of fun. And I thought that was an interesting way to see the novel too. Well, let's jump right in and talk about Ray Carney. So, and this will give you a flavor for the novel, I think. At the very beginning, um, Colin writes, where do I have it? Carney was only slightly bent when it came to being crooked. So, Linda, how do you think Carney starts out? How do we view him at the beginning?
I'm a big fan of first sentences, and I think that is one of the most unique starts. I mean, it really draws you in. It's like, what? Slightly bent? Is that
Yes.
crooked? And I think that as you read, you become so involved with Ray Carney. He's such an empathetic character that you don't want to believe he's crooked. And so everything he does is like, well, he has a reason to do that, or he's got good motivation for doing that. You're always rooting for him. So you don't want him to be the bad guy ever.
Mhm.
It's like, oh, his cousin's the bad guy. It's because of his cousin that he has to do all this stuff. But he isn't completely in the clear either. It's not like he's completely on the straight and narrow. So you can't say he's, no uncertain terms, the good guy. So
Yeah.
slightly bent works.
Yeah. Yeah, I loved that line too. And it really gives the feel for the whole novel because as you said, it is it has very serious things to say, but the tone usually feels quite light. And like you say, we're really rooting for Carney. And Whitehead also said that he wanted to write a book about a fence because Carney has his legitimate business, furniture business, which is, he also has some things in his shop, which we're not really, the provenance of them is not at all clear to him either, but he has an idea, doesn't want to really know. And then he also has one clearly where he takes some things to, a contact that he has, Bucksbaum, and he's fencing things for people, mostly Freddie. And then later, this is how it kind of, things get out of control when Freddie, who, as you say, is always causing Carney more problems. Remember, Freddie is his cousin. By telling these, more serious criminals who've decided to knock over the Hotel Teresa, oh, my brother, my cousin can probably move these jewels for you. So yeah. um, you were saying that Carney's not a bad guy, and it almost seems like Whitehead doesn't treat any of the characters that interact directly with Carney as bad guys, except people. So it's the higher echelon people who are the bad guys, like the banker who, cheats him out of the $500 envelope. The envelope is an honor. It's a badge of honor to obey the laws of envelopes. If you get an envelope, you have to come through. But, there's Freddie who constantly gets in trouble. A couple of reviewers pointed out they're sort of like Laurel and Hardy, and Whitehead does use the phrase something like it's a fine now look at the fine mess you've gotten me into, that is from the Laurel and Hardy movies and even from the time they were kids. But even though Freddie spells big trouble for Carney, how did you feel about him?
Well, he's family.
Mhm.
And so he's not just a cousin. He's like you pointed out, he's a brother. He's somebody who's really close to, somebody he's always had to take care of and looked out for. So as Freddie's troubles have gotten worse, or he's gotten himself deeper into whatever he's into, Carney's always been there. And so he can't tell his cousin to go away, even though as Carney has these higher aspirations for getting out of Harlem or moving his family into a better situation. And that kind of drives him throughout the novel. He gets all kinds of problems, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But Freddie is constantly the one yanking on his foot, pulling him back down. And he can't kick him loose because he's family. And I think that whole strength of the family bond is another big theme in the book.
Yeah, I agree. And especially Well, the couple things about that. Yeah, from the time they're little kids, like you say, Freddie is getting him in trouble, and all the way to the end, where because the trouble that Freddie gets Carney into keeps escalating, and he's still always saying, "I didn't mean for this to, get you in trouble," but it doesn't help
But
because he still suffers the consequences when they're kids. They're still both going to get a whooping, and as Freddie gets him deeper and deeper into things, there are some very serious people who are after Carney. And it's almost always because of something that Freddie got him into, although he did it. And also the family thing, we should maybe mention that Carney's dad was a criminal. And when he went away for a couple of years, Carney lived with his cousin Freddie and Freddie's mom, and that also made them stronger. And because Carney doesn't have, I don't really didn't he didn't know much about his mom. I can't remember, she passed away when he was
yeah.
young, but his dad was not a responsible dad. And he didn't want to be like his dad. He wanted to be different. He said, it doesn't matter if you're, raised a certain way, but you can choose how to go forward. So, though there is also the thing where the seed money for his furniture store was the $30,000 he found in a spare tire in his dad's car after his dad passed away. So,
That was a legal inheritance.
Yeah. So there's definitely, serious things as you were pointing out, Linda. Some of the things, he talks about, there's of course racism. And it's also racism within the community. There's the, Carney's father in-laws, his wife Elizabeth's parents look down on him and they always some kind of rug salesman and also they're very proud of their lighter skin, and they're well off too. Carney was not what they had envisioned for their daughter.
You get the impression that it's not anything to do with, well, not a lot to do with Carney or his furniture store or his prospects. Is mainly the fact that he's darker. Therefore, he has ruined her aspirations of getting out of Harlem, because the way that they plan to do that with her is through their money and her light skin. And then he's made that harder. He's made that worse.
Yes. And their grandchild is going to be darker. Yeah. And there's one part where they're talking about they were people who could pass for white and just reminded you a little bit too much that they could pass for white. So that's interesting. And also the club, I think it's the Club Dumas, isn't that the name of it?
I don't remember.
I'm not sure. You're supposed to also be lighter to be a member of that, both rich and influential and have lighter skin. So of course, Whitehead points out the racism in the larger group, but also within the community itself. So that's certainly one. And also classism, which also again with his parents. This is as good a time as any, I guess, for you to, if you want to talk about how you think, how this compares to the other two books, which I am embarrassed to say I have not read. It's two Pulitzer Prize winners, which are now on my TBR. But
well, when I first read The Underground Railroad, initially I didn't like it because I've taught the Underground Railroad in history classes too much to children, and they always think that the Underground Railroad is real. So I went, no, you can't write a book that makes the Underground Railroad an actual railroad underground. But it's not a children's novel, so we're okay on that point. It actually, when I backed off from that viewpoint, I realized I really enjoyed the magical realism, the fantasy kind of elements of the book. Now, Nickel Boys is a complete and total opposite. It is gritty and realistic. And actually, in the news recently, they found a boys' home like this in Canada also, in addition to the one he wrote about in Florida, where the boys were just abused and just treated horribly. And there's graves in the property and stuff. So very dark, very haunting book. Very different from Underground Railroad. Both of them deal with racism in different kinds of ways. Both of them are extremely historically well researched, and the writing is so rich. And that is, throughout the whole book. But it's interesting to me how all three books, whereas this one is about the Harlem Shuffle is about the 60s, and it kind of has a little bit more of a 60s feel, if you want. It's brighter, it's lighter, it's more of a rock and roll kind of a book compared to his other ones. It still has the same messages and it has the race riots and stuff. But when they mention the race riots, it's more in the line of Carney going, oh, there's a riot over there. I need to go this way to avoid it. It's not about how he's participating and how he believes in the cause or anything like that. So it's an entirely different feel. It shows more about how Carney's life is affected by the racism and the riots more so than his actual beliefs that he needs to be political, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so they're very different. And I respect that because writing historical fiction myself, I know that you have to completely research everything, but all of my historical fiction, I think, pretty much reads the same kind of tone. Whereas this is three completely different genres.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. It's a very talented writer.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting what you say about the Underground Railroad because I saw on Facebook somebody, I mean, a person said, maybe you saw it too, they were really, really annoyed by it. And the woman said, if my book hadn't been on Kindle, I would have thrown the book against the wall. She was so angry about the the things that weren't historically
Well,
accurate.
you have to look at you have to step back from that. But yeah, that was my initial reaction, having taught it and having had to convince kids, no, there was not a railroad. That's not what it was, and major discussions about it. But
yeah, the part about Carney not really being involved. In fact, there's one. I wonder if I can quickly find the quote. At one point while the riots are taking part, and he and the guy who works for him, Rusty, spend 3 or 4 nights outside in front, or maybe they're inside the furniture store with baseball bats because they're going to defend the store if the rioters come there. And they also put up a sign. The secretary made a sign that said "Black owned business," so that hopefully, in case the rioters would come that way, they wouldn't bother him. And at one point, so he's in his store and the riots are going on, and he's sitting there thinking up advertisements. So this is an example of how Whitehead uses humor in a very serious situation, and that's kind of sacrilegious because here are some of the he doesn't use these ads ultimately, but like, designed with today's rioter on the go in mind. After a long day of finding the man, why not put your feet up on a new Collins Hathaway ottoman? It's just another one that says, presenting the new Collins Hathaway 3-point recliner. Finally, a sit-in we can all agree on. So they're just, he uses humor about a serious subject. And one of the reviewers I read said, well, some people fault him for not being more serious in the book, for having not having the serious parts more front and center. And it was interesting because this reviewer said, well, maybe that in itself is sort of a rebellion, and because people are looking to art sometimes these days for like politics and not art. And he's saying, this is art. And he's got the meanings in the background, but it's not front and center in the way it is. It is in Nickel Boys, for example, the way you describe it. But yeah.
Well, that's exactly what he said he wanted to do. He wanted to write a lighter novel because Nickel Boys was so draining to write. It was horrifying, right? And so I understand that. I have a quote too about the riots. It's let's see, this is when he was during the Malcolm X riot. He was hungry, right? So he says, I get off the subway to look for a sandwich and the streets are full of people, raising their fists, waving signs, chanting, we want Malcolm X, we want Malcolm X, and killer cops must go. I'm hungry. I don't want to deal with all that. I'm trying to get a sandwich.
Yes, that long ordeal of him trying to get a sandwich. Like, where can he go in Harlem to get a sandwich? Away from the rioters. Yes, yes. So yeah, I mean, none of the characters are politically involved, really. Yeah. I mean, I guess the most politically involved is Ray Carney's wife, Elizabeth. Yes. Maybe we can talk about her for a minute because she's sort of made this choice that she's turning her back on her parents who don't like Ray Carney. She's going to marry him anyway, and they still socialize. I mean, she sees her parents. The mother-in-law comes over and helps, which Ray Carney is not that excited about because she's making cryptic remarks all the time. Not that cryptic, but uh, forgot where I was going to go. So and her job is really interesting. She works for a travel agency, which um, tells their clients, here are the places that people can go that are safe. Here are the places that are not safe. So we've since the movie The Green Book, we've all
Right.
become familiar with that phenomenon. And this her touring company goes into it in more detail. And then we get to 1964, the company is now catering to groups who are going to go to the South to do protests or
Mhm.
demonstrations or whatever actions. And again, they're saying, here's where you can go to be safe. You're not going to be safe here. So
Mhm.
I thought that was really interesting. She's really the only one who's involved in it, any of the main characters who was involved with something that could be seen as kind of political, more political
Mhm.
than any of the other ones.
I
Um,
think it shows too that they're carrying on with their lives. It's her job. It's
yeah,
not that she necessarily is political. This is a fact of
yeah,
life. You go down
yes,
there, you got to go here. You don't go there.
yeah,
And so I wouldn't even say that was necessarily political. He could
right,
have made it much
yeah,
more political
yes,
than he
yeah,
did. This is just like I
yeah,
go to work. This is what I do.
yeah,
So
yes, yes, yeah.
yeah,
You're right. You're
you
right.
can make an argument for that's not political either. It's just her job. It's what she does.
Yeah, yeah,
Because she does, it's not like she does that and she goes out and carries a sign afterwards or anything. It's just part of their
right.
daily life. But I found it interesting that they're showing the riots, and we all know how necessary that was for awakening awareness. But what they're showing through the daily lives of these characters is the necessity of a change needs to happen, and how the change
Mhm,
needs to happen,
mhm,
and how
mhm,
they are going about making the change, whereas Malcolm X and some of the other people went about it differently. So
mhm,
it's
mhm.
kind of a subtle a reminder that the riots weren't the only way to break out of Harlem and your poverty and your classism and your racism, that people were trying other ways to do that for
Yes, yeah,
themselves, not for their
yeah.
entire race.
That's an interesting point. Yes, yeah. Um, let's talk about Carney and sort of his yeah, the way he views himself. He has these two, he has this sort of legitimate side and the illegitimate side of his actions, and he kind of keeps those separate in his head. As the novel progresses, he's less and less able to do that. But there's this really interesting thing about Dorvey, which and I read an article not that long ago about really this is how we, were should be doing it before electricity. This is how we did it. So he goes to sleep for a few hours and then he gets up in the middle of the night and he'll wander around and then he comes back home and goes to sleep and usually often in the time when he's wandering around he's doing his nefarious business and it's such a great you know image for the legitimate side, the illegitimate side. In between the legitimate sleeping is this time in the middle where he's awake. And it's spelled in the novel Dorvay, but I get that's not, I suppose, the real spelling is from some French word, but there's a quote that he says something about, but he kept spelling it that way in his head because he wanted to be faithful to his mistakes. And
Yeah,
so
I
how do
did look it up. And the actual French word is from two French words that literally means a state of semi-consciousness when
you
you're like half asleep or in between sleeping. So that's exactly what it is. But it is interesting that he's faithful to his mistakes. I like that. But it
Mhm.
kind of also is, if he sees Freddie as a mistake or the relationship with Freddie as a mistake, he's faithful to that too.
Yes, yeah, that's true. That's very true. Yeah. And he has this way of sort of dividing his two lives in his head and justifying what he does. One of the things he talks about is churn. He sees, what he does if he gets these goods that, fell off a truck, and he sells them and that's the way that's churning. He's just, moving things through the society and that he sees that as a service. So it's one of the ways that he, in his head, justifies what he does. As the novel progresses, do you think he becomes, deeper and deeper in, and how does he feel about that into the illegitimate side?
He kind of gets the feeling that he's kind of drowning because when he starts out, he has very clear goals. He's going to move his family. He's even got the neighborhood picked out where he wants to go
Yes.
with his family out of Harlem. And he has a way he's going to do that through this legitimate furniture business. He's going to be a legitimate businessman who does very well and moves into a nice neighborhood. And this is all his dream. But like we said before, Freddie keeps pulling him down. And as he gets more and more involved in some of the things that are not so above board, things that are not going to make him able to move up to this fancy neighborhood, right? He kind of gets the feeling that he's drowning, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, he becomes more and more involved, and though he does, he is doing well financially, and they do move up. But I love those scenes in the first part of the novel where he's going out, and he goes out at night and he looks at different apartments and
Mhm.
different buildings, and he'll pick out an apartment and he'll sort of make up a story in his head about what's going on in that apartment. And then later he's going around and he'll think, some of these places must have some of my furniture in them.
Yes.
And where are those places? And it was just a great image of him going around and
Window
fantasizing about
shopping.
yes, window shopping. Exactly. Yes, yes, yes. Um, there's so much to say about this novel. The secondary characters, again, are wonderful. I mean, there's Pepper, who is he's a pretty tough guy, and he's actually friends with Ray's father, and so and that's part of why he helps him out. But he has, none of the characters, although they might have kind of, well, some of the characters kind of stereotypes and have names like Miami Joe, who is a bad guy and winds up getting his. And but Pepper is this guy who is, we know he's killed, and not just in the Korean War where he was, but it does. I wanted to read this one quote because again, it's an example of great writing that Whitehead is capable of. So this is talking about when Pepper was in Korea. He says, "It is one thing to believe the world was indifferent and cruel, and another to wake to proof every day in the treacherous mountain slopes, the hungry gorges and ravines, the myriad jungle treachery. Only a lazy God could deliver the meanness of things so unadorned." It's just, wow, what amazing writing.
Yeah.
And
Do you read it
it's
like a writer? You just want to put your own stuff away and say,
I
eh.
know. It's like, let's see now. What can I say here that like nothing? No, I got nothing. Yes,
Let's see,
yeah.
red or scarlet? Which word should I use?
Yeah. Oh wait, maybe Carmen. Yeah, I loved his writing, and I mean, I have like 3 pages of quotes, which I obviously can't. I just for my own fun, just wanted to, print some out for myself. There's, there are all these light moments, which happen even, there's violence, but as somebody said, it's sort of cozy violence. It's usually off stage. We don't
Yes.
usually see it. We see the results
Mhm.
sometimes, but we don't actually see it happening. And I am going, this is a big spoiler. Um, it's about Freddie, who dies in the end. And I just indulge me if I could. I'm going to read this part because so much of the novel is light, even when violent times. It's not focused on that, but here it's the way that he describes mourning, the way Carney is feeling about having lost his cousin, who's like a brother. Death took Freddie from Carney, and morning returned to him a visitation, an invisible companion who shadowed him everywhere, tugging at his sleeves and interrupting when least expected. Remember what my smile looked like. Remember me. Its voice grew quiet, and Carney didn't hear it for a while, and then it was loud again. Remember me. This is your job now. Remember me, or no one else will. At times it seemed the grief was powerful enough to shut down the world, cut off the juice, stop the earth from spinning. It was not. The world proceeded in its mealy fashion. The lights stayed on, the earth continued to spin, and its seasons ravaged and renewed. I mean, what a, how many times has mourning been described in novels that we've read, and he's still found this completely different way of describing that emotion.
Beautifully done.
Yeah. I'm gonna just sneak back to my questions here. I guess we have a couple more minutes.
Well, I'm just going to say real quick that have you read the 3 books that I read now from him? They're all about racism in different ways, in different time
Mhm.
periods, but they all show a hope for the future of race relations. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind too, that even in the ones that go really dark, or the ones that talk about dark times, or this one that's a little lighter, it all talks about how there is a future, there's a hope. It's not good now, but it can get better. And I kind of, embrace that, I think.
Oh, that's
Mhm, mhm,
interesting. Thank you for
mhm.
sharing that. Yeah. That, just one other thing, some of the reviewers mentioned it, it's a very good point. I mean, the novel asks, well, what is criminal activity in the context of the society that where that is especially brought home in the novel, not just of the largest society, but even within Harlem itself, where there are men like the banker and other people in the community who are ripping off people. They're they're taking advantage even of their own people. It's everywhere. And so what's crime when those with power are doing these things? Oh, I just wanted to mention, because last time we had a Fifth Friday book club in July, it was called The Great Mistake, and it was a historical fiction, but based on the man who was responsible for Central Park, basically. And he's called the father of New York. And they mention Central Park in this novel, and how, and it is mentioned in the Great Mistake too. People were displaced so that they could have
Mhm.
Central
Beautiful
Park.
part, yeah.
Yes, yes. So I just thought, oh, we just learned about that. Um, anything else you'd like to say in conclusion,
No,
Linda?
if you haven't read it, read it, then
Read.
listen to this.
Yeah, it is, I think, from the way you've described, easier to take than the other two. Although I'm
Mhm.
really excited now about reading the Underground Railroad. I love,
Yeah.
you said it's sort of like magic realism, which I
Yeah, it's
love.
almost magical realism because there's
Yeah.
got these fantasy elements and, yeah, so I'm like, I'll get to a point, I'm like, "I didn't know about that. Oh, okay, it didn't happen." That's the fantasy part. It is difficult for some people to um, you know, suspend their disbelief, so to speak, so
Yeah.
that you can
Yeah.
accept it, but I
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
Okay, so Colson Whitehead, thank you for your writing. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.